Tens of thousands have starved to death. More than 10 million people are still severely affected. But are the problems in the Horn of Africa simply down to nature, or are people and politics to blame? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Taimur Nabili. It is the worst famine to hit parts of Africa in decades, and the UN estimates $2.4 billion will be required to address the crisis. But many people say this tragedy was entirely predictable and preventable. So how is it that millions of people are still facing famine, and what can be done to prevent this problem from occurring again? Fungi Nguyen explains.
The most severe food crisis in recent history has hit the Horn of Africa. More than 12 million people are affected in Djibouti, Ethiopia, and Kenya. Although drought and food insecurity certainly contribute to the current crisis, lack of water is not a new environmental condition for the Horn of Africa, but rather a reoccurring one. The problem is not simply in weather, but man-made causes: politics, war, and the allocation of food and farmland.
The reason the aid hasn't gone in sufficient quantities into South and Central Somalia is because Al-Shabaab has prevented those most capable of delivering large quantities of aid from having access.
Several years of drought have driven up the price of food, but there has always been drought in the region. Except now, instead of stockpiling for supplies for a bad harvest, farmers have sold excess production for cash on the world market. Add to that, countries with high food insecurity, such as Ethiopia, have rented out their lands to grow crops for other countries instead of saving it for their own vulnerable populations. Then we have access failure. Much of the wealth in this region is invested in livestock. When the animals die because of drought, there is less money to buy food at a time when food prices are increasing worldwide. In Somalia, it is estimated that food prices have risen up to 3 times more than anywhere else in the world. Finally, there is the response failure. Instead of investing in long-term agricultural development, governments and donors wait until a crisis emerges, by which time it is too late to prevent a catastrophe. It's much easier to appeal for funds after a disaster happens than appealing for money to make the necessary structural adjustments. The current famine has taken an estimated tens of thousands of lives, leaving 3.5 million more affected. Over half of those are women and children. This at a time when global GDP is near $63 trillion, according to IMF figures. There is more than enough funds available for food beyond that of just food aid. Question is, how much longer will it take for common sense to become common practice, as millions wait in refugee camps, hungry for change? Fungi Nguyen for Inside Story.
Well, to discuss the issue, I'm joined by our guests in Geneva, Mohamed Omer Moukir, his head of community preparedness and risk reduction at the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. In London, Cleo Pascal is an associate fellow at Chatham House, specialising in energy, environment and development programmes, including food security. And from Milwaukee in Wisconsin in the US, William Mosley is a professor at Macalester College. He's written extensively on the issue of food security and famine in Africa. Thank you very much, all of you, for being with us. Now, Fungi there identified 3 broad areas: production, access and response that really need to be considered. I'd like to begin with the last one first, response. And Mohamed, let me begin with you if I could. How has the response changed in the past couple of weeks? It was about 2 weeks ago that Oxfam accused the international community of not doing enough. Willful neglect was the phrase they used, and they said the crisis, there's no longer any excuse for inaction. Have we seen any action, and has it been enough?
Thanks very much. It is improving, but it is not enough. I mean, we relaunched actually our emergency appeals for Ethiopia and Kenya. As you know that, in predicting this crisis, we already launched emergency appeal last year to assist people who are going to be affected. But unfortunately, response during last year and early this year has been very low, about 10 to 20% for Kenya and Ethiopia emergency appeals. We have seen improvement in the last few days in terms of the increase of the coverage of the emergency appeal, but it is far than being enough, and needs are changing on the ground. We are readjusting and making assessment continuously to readjust our plans and objectives and target figures, and we appeal for more support to help us meet these dynamic and changing needs of people and their assets and property.
All right, William Mosley, in Wisconsin, we heard in that package Susan Rice blaming the problems of response on the problems of access, and she says Al-Shabaab in particular was the issue. Do you agree, or is that just a convenient excuse?
I definitely think that's the kind of immediate short-term problem, because Al-Shabaab until recently has been preventing relief workers from getting into the area. But if you take a longer-term view, I think you have to think about how livelihood systems have been changing in the area. Farming systems have changed. They've become more commercially oriented, and that's been constraining herders and their movements. And this makes them more susceptible to drought than they have been in the past. And
we'll come on to the broader picture and the background and the history in just a minute if we could. I just want to concentrate on what's happening today and from now on, because Cleo Pascal in London, Al-Shabaab have said that they are now moving out of Mogadishu. The government is now saying that this is a victory of some kind. Can we hope that that problem at least will be solved and that maybe this will aid access and help some of those people who are still in danger?
Yes, absolutely. But this is a byproduct of larger geopolitical factors. And in many cases, response is dependent on other factors, decisions being made in Washington, in London, in Beijing. So what we need to do in order to try to find real response, proactive response, is to try to look at how geopolitically the world is changing and how food security is incorporated into that. So essentially, as you brought up in terms of commoditization of food, you have two different ways of looking at it. Some people are looking at food as a commodity, something that you use strictly kind of as a proxy for money exchanges. Others are looking at it from a national security perspective. Without food security, there is no national security. So the way that response happens is very much dependent on the outlook of the countries that are involved, whether food is a commodity or whether food is a national security issue.
All right, we'll delve into some of those things in just a minute. I just want one final word on this whole issue of response. And Mohammed, I'll come back to you and ask you, do you think the media play a part in any of this? Because, you know, clearly response to a large extent tends to follow the moment where the pictures appear on television of starving children, of people streaming across borders, of cattle and livestock dead in desert environments. Do you think if the media actually spent more of their time focusing on these stories before they became crises, then the rest of the world might also do so?
You are right. I mean, let me maybe give some comments or response. I mean, in addition to Kenya and Somalia, Kenya and Ethiopia, even in Somalia, we as the Red Cross Red Crescent, through the Somali Red Crescent, we are delivering every day. We are providing life-saving. We are helping pregnant and lactating women and children by providing them not only supplementary feeding and food and clean water, but by also feeding children to keep them going to schools. And you are right. I mean, media, we need long-term partnership with media, good media like Jazeera, to make sure that we are not only coming during the crisis, we are having a partnership to look at the people who are living at risk. The issues of poverty and hunger and malnutrition, those are chronic issues. We have been handling them from 1970s and for centuries ago. But the trouble of media, they only come at the peak of the crisis. That's one point. Secondly, in most time, what we have seen in this time, the media has been distracted by the other bigger events. When we launched our emergency appeal last year, most of the globe, they've been busy with Pakistan flood, they've been busy with Japan earthquake and tsunami, they've been busy with the Arab Spring, and that all diverted the attention of the policymakers and the private sector and the public sector to focus attention to the chronic needs in these high-risk areas. So I agree with you for the slow onset, for the chronic problems of malnutrition and hunger and poverty, media need to have longer-term partnership, not only with government, but with government and non-governmental organizations and United Nations to make sure that all of us were pushing on the same direction of the Millennium Development Goals.
All right. Well, having dealt with that, I mean, let's just hope that the departure of al-Shabaab, certainly from some areas, and the increased attention of the world will help solve the future problems. So let's go backwards now and discuss how we ended up here in the first place and some of the problems that our guests have already brought up. Let me come back to you in Milwaukee, William, and ask you to outline exactly the scope of the problem here, because it's a complex one. We can blame global warming to a large extent. We can blame foreign governments for taking up some of the arable land to a certain extent, and we can blame local governments. I mean, just break down for us how you see those things balancing out and where we should be looking for a solution.
Sure. So this is a region that has long experienced rainfall variability. This is nothing new. Traditionally local livelihoods were adapted to that variability. I think also critical is that global food prices have been rising since 2000. Like you said in the introduction, they're now 3 times what they normally are. So particularly for a pastoral population that raises animals, sells those to acquire food, this is a major access problem. So thinking, longer term, how do you rebuild these livelihoods? Some people have argued that you need a new green revolution approach, a more commercial approach. I think that's very problematic in this particular area of the world, and we need to focus on kind of strengthening local livelihoods. Pardon?
You said these solutions being proposed are problematic. I just wondered what you meant by that.
Well, the USAID has said in terms of a longer-term strategy, they want to increase food security in the region through a new green revolution approach. So increasing agricultural productivity through hybrid seeds, fertilizers, pesticides. And in this particular area, I think that's problematic because the poorest of the poor don't have they can't afford to sustain those types of technologies. So I think we need to think about how do you support traditional pastoral livelihoods and traditional farming livelihoods.
So, I mean, basically what you're saying there, if I can put my finger on it, or correct me if I'm wrong, but what you're saying is that what is still happening is foreign governments and foreign corporations in particular attempting to control the way the agriculture is done, and that is not necessarily in the interests of the local people.
Well, to be fair, I think in many instances, they mean well, but I think it's a problematic approach in this particular instance. You do have certain situations which you alluded to in the introduction, for example, in Ethiopia, with long-term leases of land to foreign entities, governments, and corporations for the production of food for export. That clearly is not in the interest of local people and is highly problematic.
Cleo, is that a reasonable general analysis of the situation, or do you see other factors at play here?
There are myriad factors at play. To understand it in depth, you really need to go very broad because so many different elements are coming into play. There's a very good reason why foreign corporations and sovereign wealth funds are investing in land in Africa, and that's because they're concerned about their own domestic security. So there's this food, they're basically offloading their food insecurity onto Africa. But their own food insecurity is...
By which you mean they're buying up land in Africa and using it to grow crops for their own populations and leaving no land left to feed the local population, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, if you're looking at a situation like, for example, the Arab Spring, you will find a component of food insecurity within the uprisings that happened. In Egypt, you had a food price, wheat price of about 30%, which contributed to the discontent on the street. Now, that was caused in part because Russia had cut off wheat exports because of the fires that they had, which had reduced their wheat crop, and they didn't want to export because they were concerned there wouldn't be enough wheat to keep their population quiet. So when you start to unravel it, you can see that, essentially all the other food insecurity is being offloaded onto Africa, and Africa is absorbing this highly fractured interrelated, unsteady system.
So sorry to interrupt, but I just want to be exactly
Please.
clear on where we are on this, because it doesn't get that much attention. I mean, there have been news stories on this, particularly when Madagascar decided it was going to kick back against that kind of corporate buying of land. But nonetheless, I mean, we're seeing an enormous amount of it going on. The German African policy coordinator blamed China specifically, but we've seen Great Britain highly involved in this. Korea, Saudi Arabia and the UAE. There are countries all over the world buying up large areas of Africa for their own benefit. Is this a trend that's getting worse, and is anybody actually doing anything to try and address it as an issue?
Not really. I mean, nobody's trying to address it as an issue. And part of the problem is that in many cases they're buying land, but they're not actually efficiently producing food. They're not. The problem actually in the linkage is the farm management and actually being able to produce food in a reasonable way. So you're seeing areas that had been productive for the local population, small-scale local farmers, becoming not efficient in terms of food production for this food shipment abroad. But still, it's being held by abroad as a kind of lifeboat in case things get particularly bad. Although in some cases, like in the Middle East, almost all the food is imported, which means they're, again, offloading their food insecurity onto another location.
It's not, Mohammed, entirely fair to blame the foreigners on their own, is it? There's a lot of local government participation in all of this. Just to name a couple of things, Tanzania's recent memorandum of understanding that they've signed with the US company Agrisol, pretty much getting into bed with the multinational corporations at the expense of their own populations. We've had the largest land deal in South Sudan was tied up with the Texas-based firm Nile Trading, where a lot of the land has been taken up for the purposes of production for other people. The local governments are as much of a problem here, aren't they?
It is, actually. I mean, if you look at the chronic nature of this, I think it's failure of developmental policies of government, not only in farming and agriculture, but in also economic development, into education development, into health development in these marginal areas. If you look at the pockets of famine in the Horn of Africa and in Africa in general, this is very well-known pockets, and their problems, especially if you take pastoralists and traditional farmers, they're being kept out of the socio-economic and political system. And that's what caused these problems. I mean, what you see now, for me, production is very important and key part of food security for any nation or for region or for the globe. But I think what we see, sadly, is more of an issue of access. There is a problem of accessibility. There is a problem we need to get economic diversification to make sure that those people, nomadic, they are not so dependent only on animals or traditional farming. But once they get into crisis, they have other coping strategies and they've been supported on that. I think the big national failure has been we have not been supporting local coping mechanisms of the people, including in health and education. And we left them to cope on their own with whatever little they have, and that has been depleted. It is little for me issue about production. I mean, if you take the global production system and the global food balance sheet, it's not in deficit. There is food which is going to maybe feed the globe 3, 4, 5 times. But the trouble of distribution, it is a problem of having access to that. It's a problem of income diversification for these people, and it's an issue for including them into socio-economic and political system in their countries.
Let me stop you there and throw it across to William. Do you agree? I mean, is the problem not one of actual existence of food, but just the mechanics of getting it to the right places?
I mean, there is a short-term availability problem within the Horn of Africa, in particular within Somalia, we can't get aid into that area. I do disagree slightly with the previous commentator. I think we need to really work with local livelihoods and try to strengthen those. And remember that traditionally, local farmers kept aside a surplus which they would go back to in a bad year. We've drifted away from that as farmers have become more market-oriented. I think we need to reinforce that traditional strategy. And also think about, one of the primary things that happens in these situations is that the price of livestock plummets. So if you can get in, give people a decent price for their livestock, that's going to give them the means to purchase food.
Mohammed, let me just ask you to respond to that, because it does seem that there are broader issues than the ones you just outlined.
No, absolutely. I mean, I agree with the economic, what I said is economic diversification. That means we have to support the other mean of livelihood of these people. That's one clear element. And we have to make sure that we support the local coping mechanism of at that micro level. The issue for us, if you take it in every day, drought and famine and hunger is not going to disappear. That need a longer-term investment, and that longer-term investment has to be led by national government and local government, and it has to include at the center of it supporting the livelihood system and local coping mechanism of the public, and that include not only the food production and their animals, but education, health, and water. Those are the three key areas to be supported in a longer term.
Cleo, should we be talking in terms of coping? Should we not be talking more in terms of actual concrete action? It's, you know, the corporations and the governments of the West have, in the past, let's be fair, not been particularly sensitive to the local needs when it comes to taking resources from other countries. And it's fairly naive to expect that they will be in the future, isn't it?
Yeah, and I wouldn't limit it just to the West. I mean, if you look at Zimbabwe, which was highly agriculturally productive for a very long time, and then got not such great governance, and the West tried to isolate that governance, but that just helped China to jump in and say, look, you have no other friends, you really need us, and support bad governance, which resulted in a collapse of the agricultural sector. You can see that this is something that's happening in many areas for many different reasons with many different actors. So I think we need, you know, an across-the-board analysis, and not just at the top geopolitically about who's doing what, why, and this national security imperative in terms of domestic food security for countries like China. China cannot produce enough food to feed itself. It simply does not have enough water. And when you get down to this food security issue, essentially what you get down to is water security.
Yeah, fair
point. That was mentioned by Mohammed.
I mean, it's not just the West in the future. The West, to a large extent, you know, set the template for the behaviour. But you're right, it's a global problem now. Which, coming to the end, very quickly, I'd just like to see what you guys think may be a good way forward to making sure we don't see more of this in the future. William, can I ask you quickly to address that?
I think it's critical to support local and regional food systems. We had 2 decades of low food prices in the 80s and 90s. I think the region adapted to that. They expected kind of consistently low food prices. That's not going to be happening in the future. As energy prices have gone up and they're predicted to go up further, that's going to keep upward pressure on global food prices. So we can't be dependent on external markets. You need to bolster local food systems so that this area becomes more self-sufficient.
Mohammed, to you quickly for a final summary of what you think is required right now.
I think we need at least 10-year longer-term interventions, integrated interventions to handle root causes of hunger and malnutrition, and that including emergency response. Emergency response has to be part of a longer-term plan. That's one element. Second element, we wanted to see the commitment for the World Food Conference. I mean, if you take the World Food Conference 1974, there was one statement on that. From now on, no child will sleep hungry in Africa. And now we have only in the Horn of Africa 2 million children may be facing death. This is the 2 elements we need delivery on it. Longer-term intervention plan. We need the global and national policymakers to commit to their statements in the World Food Summit.
And Cleo, the final 45 seconds to you.
It has to be understood that food is not a commodity, it's a security issue. And local security issues, because of how interconnected we are becoming global security issues. What happens in Russia affects what happens in Egypt, which affects what happens in Washington, which affects what happens in Beijing. We can no longer afford to allow speculators, for example, to control the food market because it's affecting global security.
And there we will leave it. Cleo Pascal in London with Chatham House. Thank you for being with us. Also in Geneva, Mohammed Omer Mukir, who is with the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, and from Milwaukee in Wisconsin, William Mosley. Thank you all for joining us on this edition of the programme and for your comments. And also thank you for watching the show. We welcome your comments and suggestions as well. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. That's it for now. Bye-bye.